The security badge slipped from Evangeline's trembling fingers as she stood frozen outside the mahogany doors of the executive suite. 26 floors below, Manhattan hummed with its usual chaos, but up here in the glass tower that housed Blackthorn Industries, silence stretched like a held breath. She had practiced this moment 1,000 times in her cramped Brooklyn apartment, rehearsing every gesture, every response, every lie that would get her close enough to the truth about what really happened to her parents 10 years ago. The badge clattered against the marble floor with a sound that seemed to echo through her bones. As she bent to retrieve it, the doors swung open with mechanical precision. "Miss Sinclair." The voice cut through the air like winter wind. "You're 3 minutes late." Evangeline straightened slowly, her fabricated resume clutched against her chest like armor. Caspian Blackthorn stood in the doorway, filling the frame with a presence that seemed to suck the oxygen from the corridor. At 32, he possessed the kind of sharp-edged attractiveness that came from power and privilege, but his steel-gray eyes held something darker. Something that made her stomach clench with recognition she couldn't quite name. "I apologize, Mr. Blackthorn." The elevator was. "I don't accept excuses." He stepped aside, a gesture that felt more like a command than courtesy. "Enter." The executive suite stretched before her like a monument to corporate dominance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city that her parents had once helped build before it all came crashing down. Before the Blackthorn family made sure they lost everything. Before the accident that wasn't an accident. Caspian moved behind his desk with predatory grace, each step deliberate and measured. He didn't sit. Instead, he remained standing, forcing her to crane her neck to meet his gaze. The power play was obvious, textbook even, but effective nonetheless. "Your references are impeccable," he said, his fingers drumming once against the glass surface. "Stanford MBA, 3 years at Morrison & Associates, fluent in 4 languages. Impressive for someone I've never heard of." Heat crept up Evangeline's neck. She had spent months creating Elena Sinclair's background, paying hackers to plant records and databases, bribing former Morrison employees to corroborate her story if anyone called. But something in his tone suggested he already knew more than he was letting on. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself, sir." "Do you?" It wasn't a question. He opened a manila folder and began reading from what she assumed was her fake application. Born in Portland, Oregon. Parents deceased. No siblings. Moved to New York 5 years ago to pursue opportunities in corporate finance. His eyes lifted from the page, pinning her in place. "Tell me, Miss Sinclair, what opportunities specifically brought you to my company?" The question hung between them like a trap waiting to be sprung. Evangeline forced her breathing to remain steady, drawing on every acting class she had taken while building her new identity. The truth clawed at her throat, wanting to spill out in an angry torrent. "Your father destroyed my family. Your company killed my parents. I'm here to prove it." Instead, she smiled the practiced smile of Elena Sinclair, ambitious assistant. Blackthorn Industries represents the pinnacle of American business success. The opportunity to learn from leaders like yourself was too valuable to pass up. Flattery. The word dripped with disdain. How refreshingly honest in its dishonesty. Before she could respond, he was moving again, circling her with the fluid motion of a shark testing the waters. She caught his scent as he passed, something expensive and clean that made her pulse stutter despite herself. This wasn't part of the plan. She wasn't supposed to notice anything about him except his weaknesses. "Your typing speed is acceptable," he continued, still reading from her file. "Your organizational skills adequate. But there's something else here that intrigues me." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see gold flecks in his gray eyes. "You have an unusual knowledge of corporate mergers and acquisitions for someone who supposedly spent 3 years filing papers at Morrison & Associates." Evangeline's mouth went dry. During the interview process, she had demonstrated expertise that Elena Sinclair shouldn't possess, knowledge gained from years of studying her parents' case files and business records. She had been so focused on proving she could do the job that she hadn't considered how suspicious her competence might appear. "I'm a quick learner," she managed. "Are you?" Again, not a question. He closed the folder with a soft snap. "Here's what's going to happen, Miss Sinclair. You're going to sit at that desk, answer my phones, manage my calendar, and handle my correspondence. You're going to be efficient, discreet, and invisible. Most importantly, You're going to remember that this building has eyes and ears in every corner, and very little happens here without my knowledge." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Evangeline nodded, not trusting her voice. "Excellent." Caspian returned to his chair, dismissing her with the gesture. "Your first task is to compile the quarterly reports for the Sterling Rosemont acquisition. The files are in the cabinet marked Archive." The name hit her like a physical blow. Sterling Rosemont. Her parents' company. The acquisition that had destroyed everything she had ever known. He was testing her, watching for a reaction, and she barely managed to keep her expression neutral. "Of course, sir. Should I prioritize any particular aspects of the acquisition?" "All of it." His smile was razor-thin. "Every detail, Miss Sinclair. Leave nothing out." As she turned toward the archive cabinet, Evangeline felt his gaze boring into her back like a physical weight. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle. 10 years of grief and rage threatening to overwhelm the careful mask of Elena Sinclair. The first file contained photographs of her parents' final board meeting. Her mother's smile. Her father's confident handshake with Magnus Blackthorne. Neither of them knowing they had less than a week to live. The lights died at exactly 6:47 p.m. Evangeline was alone in the elevator, descending from the 47th floor with a box of Sterling Rosemont files clutched against her chest, when the car lurched to a violent stop. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting everything in an eerie red glow that made the small space feel like a tomb. Her first thought was escape. Her second was panic. The third was the horrifying realization that the files she carried contained her parents' death certificates, and she was trapped with evidence she shouldn't have been able to access. The elevator shuddered, groaned, then fell silent. "Perfect," she whispered, pressing the emergency button repeatedly. Nothing. The phone was dead, the display blank. Outside the building, Manhattan had gone dark, visible through the narrow gap where the doors hadn't quite closed properly. The blackout stretched in every direction, a void that seemed to swallow the city whole. Footsteps echoed in the shaft above her. Heavy, measured, familiar. "Miss Sinclair." Caspian's voice drifted down through the emergency hatch. "I trust you're having a productive evening." Even trapped in a powerless elevator, his tone carried that insufferable note of authority. Evangeline looked up at the ceiling, calculating distances. The space between her car and his had to be minimal. In the darkness above, she could hear him moving around, probably trying the same useless buttons she had already tested. "The backup generators should engage momentarily," he called down. "Should," she replied, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "But they haven't." A metallic grinding sound filled the shaft as his elevator descended another few feet, stopping just above hers. Through the gap in her doors, she could see the bottom of his car, separated by perhaps 3 feet of empty space. "The building's emergency protocols are designed to handle temporary power fluctuations," he continued, his voice closer now. "This appears to be something more significant." Evangeline shifted the files to one arm and tried the phone again. Still dead. How significant? Given that half of Manhattan appears to be offline, I'd estimate we're looking at several hours minimum. Several hours. Trapped in a metal box with stolen files and a man who would probably have her arrested if he knew who she really was. Evangeline closed her eyes and tried to control the surge of claustrophobia, threatening to overwhelm her careful composure. "Mr. Blackthorne," she called up, "is there any way to access the emergency stairs from your position?" "Negative. The shaft doors are electromagnetically sealed. Even if I could force them open, we're suspended between floors." A pause. "However, I may be able to reach your elevator." Before she could ask what he meant, the emergency hatch above her head began to move. Lights spilled down as the cover lifted, and suddenly Caspian was lowering himself through the opening with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to taking control of impossible situations. He dropped into her car with barely a sound, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite crawling through elevator shafts. In the confined space, he seemed larger than before, his presence filling every available inch. The red emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look dangerous and unfamiliar. "Well," he said, straightening his tie with casual precision. "This is cozy." Evangeline pressed herself against the far wall, suddenly acutely aware of how small the elevator was with both of them inside. "There has to be a way out." "There is." "We wait." He leaned against the opposite wall, studying her with those penetrating gray eyes. "Tell me, Miss Sinclair, what exactly are you carrying?" Her arms tightened around the files instinctively. "Quarterly reports. As you requested. Quarterly reports that required access to sealed archive boxes." His gaze dropped to the manila folders visible beneath her arms. Boxes that should have been locked. Heat flooded her cheeks. She had picked the lock on the archive cabinet within her first hour on the job, a skill learned during her years of preparation for this moment. But admitting that would destroy Elena Sinclair's carefully constructed cover story. "The cabinet was open when I arrived this morning," she lied. Was it? That familiar tone again, the one that made statements sound like accusations. How convenient. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of sirens echoing through the darkened city. Evangeline could feel sweat beading along her hairline despite the cool air circulation. Being this close to him was wreaking havoc on her nervous system in ways she hadn't anticipated. His cologne, something woodsy and expensive, seemed to fill the small space. Every time he moved, she caught glimpses of the man beneath the corporate armor, and it was deeply unsettling. "You're frightened," he observed. "I'm concerned about the building's structural integrity during a power failure." "No." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see her own reflection in his eyes. "You're frightened of me." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Evangeline lifted her chin, calling on every ounce of courage she possessed. "Should I be? That depends entirely on what you're hiding." The words hit too close to home. Everything about her presence here was a lie, from her name to her resume to her reasons for wanting this job. But looking into his face in the red half-light, she saw something unexpected. Beneath the cold authority and razor-sharp intelligence, there was loneliness. A kind of profound isolation that she recognized because it mirrored her own. "I'm not hiding anything," she said quietly. "Everyone hides something, Miss Sinclair." His voice had dropped lower, more intimate in the darkness. "The question is whether it's worth protecting." Before she could respond, the elevator shuddered again, tilting slightly to one side. Evangeline stumbled, and suddenly Caspian's hands were on her arms, steadying her against his chest. The files scattered across the floor, forgotten in the moment of contact. His touch burned through the thin fabric of her blouse, sending shock waves through her entire system. She had never been this close to a man before, never felt the heat of masculine strength or caught the subtle scent of skin beneath expensive cologne. Her inexperience showed in the way her breath caught, in the tremor that ran through her body at the simple contact. "Have you ever been kissed, Miss Sinclair?" The question came out of nowhere, spoken so softly she almost thought she had imagined it. But his eyes were locked on her mouth, and his hands hadn't moved from her arms. "That's inappropriate," she whispered. "Yes, it is." He didn't step away. "Answer the question." Truth spilled out before she could stop it. "No." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession. Caspian's hands remained on her arms, his thumbs tracing small circles against her skin that sent electric currents straight to her core. In the red emergency lighting, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, predatory and beautiful in equal measure. 26 years old and never been kissed, he murmured, his voice rough with something that sounded almost like wonder. "How is that possible?" Evangeline tried to step back, but the elevator wall prevented any escape. "I've been focused on my career." "Your career?" His laugh held no humor. "Or running from something." The accuracy of his observation made her stomach clench. She had been running, in a way. Running from the grief that had consumed her teenage years, from the foster homes that never felt safe, from the burning need for justice that had driven every decision since she turned 18. There had been no time for romance. No space in her life for anything beyond the singular goal of making the Blackthorne family pay for what they had done. "Not everyone has the luxury of living for pleasure, Mr. Blackthorne." Caspian. His name on his lips sounded different in the darkness, less formal, more dangerous. "If we're going to be trapped here for hours, we might as well dispense with formalities." The elevator groaned around them, a reminder of their precarious situation. Outside, the city remained dark, emergency sirens wailing in the distance like urban wolves. Evangeline had never felt more isolated or more aware of her own vulnerability. "How long have you been planning this?" Caspian asked suddenly. "Planning what?" "Whatever game you're playing." He released her arms and stepped back, giving her space to breathe. You show up with perfect credentials, demonstrate knowledge you shouldn't possess, and happen to request access to files that were sealed 10 years ago. Either you're the most coincidental hire in corporate history, or you have an agenda. Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. She bent to gather the scattered files, buying herself time to think. In the red light, the papers looked like blood spills across the elevator floor. Her parents' faces stared up at her from a newspaper clipping, frozen in time at some long-ago company function. The Sterling Rosemont acquisition was significant, she said carefully, not looking up from the papers. Any business student would be familiar with the case. Business students don't typically know the specific merger terms or the identity of the consulting firm that handled the due diligence. Evangeline's hand stilled. During her earlier review of the files, she had made notes in the margins, corrections to what she knew were deliberately falsified records. Details that Elena Sinclair had no business knowing. I'm thorough in my research. You corrected the valuation figures. Caspian crouched beside her, his proximity making it impossible to concentrate. The ones listed in the official documentation. How did you know they were wrong? The question was a trap with no good answer. The official records had been doctored to make Sterling Rosemont appear less valuable than it actually was, justifying the below-market acquisition price. Only someone with access to the original financial statements would know the real numbers. Someone like the daughter of the company's founders. Lucky guess, she said weakly. Try again. His voice held steel now, the corporate predator emerging fully. Evangeline realized that she had been playing chess with a grandmaster, and every move she had made was leading her inexorably toward checkmate. The acquisition destroyed that company, she said finally, abandoning pretense for something closer to truth. Hundreds of people lost their jobs. Entire families were ruined. Maybe I just wanted to understand how something like that could happen. Companies fail every day. Why does this one matter to you? The question pierced straight through her carefully constructed defenses. In the cramped elevator, surrounded by evidence of her parents' destruction, the weight of 10 years of grief and rage pressed down on her like a physical force. She had spent so long being Elena Sinclair that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be Evangeline Rosemont. Because some failures aren't accidents, she whispered. Caspian went very still. What did you say? Nothing. I didn't say anything. Sterling Rosemont wasn't a failure. His words came slowly, as if he was working through a puzzle in real time. It was a targeted acquisition. The company was profitable, well-managed, positioned for expansion. Magnus Blackthorne wanted their technology patents and their client base. And he got them. Yes, he did. Caspian's eyes narrowed, along with something else he wasn't expecting, which was evidence that James and Victoria Rosemont had discovered irregularities in Blackthorne Industries' environmental compliance reports. They were planning to go public with information that could have cost us hundreds of millions in federal fines. The revelation hit Evangeline like a physical blow. She had known her parents were investigating something before they died, but she had never understood what. Now, sitting in the darkness with files scattered around them like fragments of a broken life, the pieces began falling into place. So they had to be stopped, she said. They had to be convinced to stay quiet. Caspian's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. The acquisition was supposed to buy their silence along with their company. But they refused. They refused. He was studying her face with laser intensity now, as if he could read her thoughts written across her skin. 3 days after the final merger documents were signed, their car went off the Williamsburg Bridge. Brake failure, according to the police report. Evangeline's vision blurred with unshed tears. Hearing the clinical details of her parents' death spoken aloud by the son of their killer was almost more than she could bear. But she forced herself to remain Elena Sinclair, forced herself to show nothing more than professional curiosity. That's terrible, she managed. Yes, it was. Caspian reached out and lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. Tell me, Miss Sinclair, what was your mother's maiden name? The question came out of nowhere, designed to catch her off guard. Evangeline's mind raced through Elena Sinclair's fabricated background, searching for details she had memorized months ago. Morrison, she said. And your father's occupation? Insurance adjuster. Interesting. His thumb traced along her jawline, the touch gentle but somehow threatening. Because 5 minutes ago, when you were looking at that newspaper photo, you whispered "Mama" under your breath. The words hung between them like a death sentence. Evangeline felt the blood drain from her face as Caspian's thumb continued its slow trace along her jaw, his touch now feeling like a predator savoring the moment before the kill. "I don't know what you think you heard," she whispered, but her voice cracked on the lie. "I think I heard a daughter mourning her mother." His gray eyes had turned to ice, all traces of the gentleness she had glimpsed earlier vanishing like smoke. "Which raises some very interesting questions about who you really are, Miss Sinclair." The elevator shuddered again, reminding them both of their precarious position suspended between floors in a powerless building. But the physical danger seemed insignificant compared to the emotional minefield that had just exploded between them. Caspian released her face and stood, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "Elena Sinclair doesn't exist, does she? At least not the version sitting in front of me." Evangeline remained crouched among the scattered files, her hands trembling as she tried to gather the papers that contained the story of her family's destruction. "You're being paranoid." "Am I?" He stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that seemed to strip away every carefully constructed layer of her false identity. "Let me tell you what I think happened. I think a very intelligent, very determined young woman spent months, maybe years, creating an identity that would get her close to the Blackthorne family. I think she forged documents, bribed officials, and probably broke about a dozen federal laws in the process." Each word was a direct hit, dismantling the fictional life she had built with surgical precision. Evangeline felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he could see straight through to the scared 16-year-old girl who had stood at her parents' graveside and sworn an oath of vengeance. "I think," he continued relentlessly, "that she came here looking for evidence to destroy the company that destroyed her family. And I think her name is Evangeline Rosemont." The sound of her real name spoken aloud in his voice broke something inside her chest. For 10 years, she had been nobody and everybody except herself. Foster homes had called her by case numbers. Schools had known her as whatever surname her current guardians carried. The few people who remembered Victoria and James Rosemont's daughter assumed she had disappeared into the system like so many other orphan children. But Caspian Blackthorne knew exactly who she was. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly, abandoning any pretense of maintaining her cover. "I suspected from the moment you walked into my office." He crouched down again, bringing himself to her eye level. "You have your mother's eyes and your father's stubborn chin. I met them both several times during the acquisition negotiations." The casual mention of her parents as real people he had actually known sent a fresh wave of grief through her system. For so long, they had existed only in her memory and in faded photographs. Hearing someone else acknowledge their existence made them feel real again, and that somehow made their loss even more devastating. "You were just a child when it happened," Caspian continued, his voice softer now. 16, according to the family records we kept. Old enough to understand what you had lost, but too young to do anything about it. Until now." "Until now." He nodded grimly. "Though I have to admit, I'm impressed by the scope of your preparation. Creating Elena Sinclair required serious resources and connections. How did you manage it?" Evangeline looked down at the files scattered around them, her parents' faces staring up from newspaper clippings and corporate headshots. "Theodore Rosemont wasn't just my father's business partner. He was my uncle, my father's brother. Uncle Theodore." Recognition flickered across Caspian's features. "He disappeared about 6 years ago. The police assumed he was dead." "He's not dead." The words came out harder than she intended. "He's been planning this for years. Building resources, making connections, waiting for the right moment to strike back at the family that destroyed his brother. And you're his weapon. I'm his niece." She met his gaze steadily, drawing strength from the fury that had sustained her through years of preparation. "And I'm here to finish what my parents started." Caspian was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of her revelation. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Evangeline, there are things about your parents' death that you don't understand. Things that go deeper than corporate greed or patent theft. I understand enough." She gathered the last of the scattered papers, clutching them against her chest like armor. "I understand that your father wanted something my parents wouldn't give him, so he had them killed. It wasn't that simple. Murder is pretty simple, actually. You decide someone is a problem, and you eliminate them." "You're right." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. But you're also wrong about who gave the orders. Something in his tone made her stomach clench with dread. What are you talking about? Magnus Blackthorne wanted your parents' company, yes. But he didn't want them dead. Caspian's gray eyes held shadows she hadn't noticed before, as if he was looking at scenes only he could see. That decision was made by someone else. Someone who had more to lose if their environmental investigation went public. Who? Someone who had been falsifying compliance reports for years. Someone who stood to face criminal charges and federal prosecution if your parents' evidence ever saw daylight. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Someone who made sure I was standing right beside him when he gave the order to make the problem disappear permanently. The implications of his words crashed over her like a tsunami. You knew. I knew. You were there when the decision was made to kill them. I was 22 years old, fresh out of business school, and completely out of my depth. His confession came out in a rush, as if he had been holding it back for years. But yes, I was there. And yes, I knew what was going to happen to them. Evangeline stared at him, her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. She had spent 10 years hating the Blackthorne family as a faceless enemy, never imagining that one day she would be trapped in an elevator with the man who had watched her parents' murder being planned. Why didn't you stop it? Because I was a coward. The words seemed to physically pain him. And because I believed what I was told about the greater good and acceptable losses and protecting the company's future. My parents were acceptable losses. Yes. His voice cracked on the admission. To my eternal shame, yes, they were. The silence that followed Caspian's confession was deafening. In the red emergency lighting, Evangeline could see her own reflection in his eyes, and what she saw there was a stranger. Someone capable of violence. Someone whose carefully controlled facade had finally cracked open to reveal the rage beneath. Acceptable losses. She repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitterness. My mother was an acceptable loss. My father was an acceptable loss. The 16-year-old girl who came home from school to find police cars in her driveway was an acceptable loss. Evangeline. Don't. She held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Don't you dare say my name. You don't get to use my name after what you just told me. Caspian flinched as if she had struck him. I was young. I was stupid. I've regretted it every day for 10 years. Regret. She laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. How convenient for you. How absolutely fucking convenient that you get to feel bad about it while they're still dead. I tried to stop it. After the decision was made, I tried to warn them. Bullshit. I called your father's office the morning of the accident. I was going to tell him everything. Give him enough information to disappear with his family before. Before what? Before your people could murder them. Evangeline was on her feet now, the files forgotten as fury coursed through her veins like liquid fire. You called to warn them, and somehow they still ended up dead. Either you're lying, or you're even more incompetent than you are cowardly. The accusation hit its target. Caspian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw past his corporate mask to the raw guilt underneath. I was too late. By the time I worked up the courage to make the call, they were already gone. How touching. The guilty conscience that was 10 hours too late to save anyone. You think I haven't paid for that failure? His voice rose to match hers, the careful control finally cracking. You think I haven't spent every day since wondering what would have happened if I had been braver, if I had acted sooner, if I had chosen differently? I think you've spent every day since living in luxury while I grew up in foster care. The words came out like bullets, each one aimed to wound. I think you've spent every day since building your fortune on the foundation of my parents' graves. That's not fair. Evangeline stepped closer, close enough to see the pain she was inflicting reflected in his eyes. You want to talk about fair? Let me tell you what fair would have been. Fair would have been you in prison. Fair would have been Magnus Blackthorne facing federal charges. Fair would have been my parents living to see their daughter graduate from high school. The elevator shuddered around them, a metallic groan that seemed to echo the tension crackling between their bodies. But neither of them noticed. They were locked in a battle that had been 10 years in the making, and there would be no retreat. I can't change what happened, Caspian said quietly. But I can help you get justice now. Justice. She spit the word like a curse. From the man who helped plan their murder. That's rich. I have access to files you'll never see. Records that prove exactly what happened and who gave the orders. Evidence that could put the real killers behind bars. And what would you want in return for this sudden attack of conscience? Nothing. Everyone wants something, Caspian. You taught me that. The use of his first name seemed to surprise him. In the red light, his face softened slightly, and she caught a glimpse of something that looked almost like hope. Maybe I want forgiveness, he said. Then you're going to be disappointed. Evangeline reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the red light indicating it had been running throughout their conversation. Because I didn't come here for your confession or your help or your guilt-ridden absolution. Caspian's eyes locked onto the device, understanding dawning across his features. How long has that been recording? Since the moment you climbed into this elevator. She smiled, and it was sharp enough to cut glass. Everything you just told me about knowing my parents were going to be murdered, about being present when the decision was made, about trying to warn them too late to matter. All of it recorded, time-stamped, and uploaded to a secure server the moment this building's power comes back online. You're making a mistake. The only mistake I made was listening to your sob story instead of just taking what I came for. She moved toward the scattered files, gathering the most damaging documents while keeping the recorder visible. These files contain enough evidence to prove industrial sabotage, environmental fraud, and murder conspiracy. Combined with your recorded confession, they'll be more than sufficient to destroy Blackthorn Industries and everyone connected to it, including innocent employees, including people who had nothing to do with your parents' death. Acceptable losses. She threw his own words back at him with surgical precision. Isn't that what you called them? Caspian was very still now, and when he spoke his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration mixed with genuine fear. You planned this. All of it. The job application, the archive access, even getting trapped in this elevator together. Theodore taught me well. Evangeline straightened, clutching the files and the recorder like weapons. We've been planning this for 6 years. Every detail, every contingency, every possible scenario that would get me close enough to record exactly what you just confessed to. The blackout. Electromagnetic pulse, targeted at the building's main power grid. Theodore has friends with very specialized skills. She smiled again, and this time it held genuine warmth. Did you really think a girl who grew up in foster care could afford to create an identity like Elena Sinclair on her own? The revelation seemed to hit him like a physical blow. You've been playing me from the beginning. I've been playing your entire family from the beginning. Evangeline moved toward the emergency button panel, her finger hovering over the call switch. And now it's time to collect payment. Wait. Caspian stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch her face again. Whatever you think you know about that night, whatever you think you recorded, there are things you still don't understand. Such as the fact that I wasn't the only person in that room who tried to stop what happened to your parents. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. And I wasn't the only person who failed. Before she could ask what he meant, the lights flickered back to life, and the elevator hummed to life around them. The spell of intimacy created by darkness and confession was broken, replaced by the harsh fluorescent reality of corporate warfare. Miss Rosemont, Caspian said formally, using her real name like a weapon. You're fired. The elevator doors slid open with mechanical precision, revealing the executive floor bathed in normal lighting. The spell of the blackout was broken, and with it, any illusion that the conversation they had shared in the darkness would remain private. Evangeline stepped out first, her stolen files clutched against her chest like a shield, the digital recorder still warm in her palm. Security will escort you from the building, Caspian said, his voice once again carrying the cold authority of a corporate executive. But she caught the slight tremor beneath the words, the hairline crack in his composure that suggested their encounter had affected him more than he wanted to admit. That won't be necessary. Evangeline turned to face him, noting how different he looked in the harsh fluorescent lighting. The intimacy of their shared confessions seemed like something that had happened years ago instead of minutes. I have what I came for. Do you? He stepped out of the elevator behind her, straightening his tie with practiced precision. Because what you have is a recording of a 22-year-old's coerced confession and a handful of financial documents that prove nothing more than aggressive business practices. The confidence in his voice made her stomach clench with sudden doubt. Your confession proves you had prior knowledge of my parents' murder. My confession proves I was present when decisions were made by other people. People with far more power and far less to lose than a recent business school graduate with no real authority in the company. Before she could respond, the soft chime of the elevator behind them announced another arrival. The doors opened to reveal a man who could only be Magnus Blackthorne. Even at 67, he commanded the space around him with the kind of presence that bent reality to his will. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his suit more expensive than anything Evangeline had owned in her entire life, and his pale blue eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. Caspian. His voice carried the weight of old money and older power. I trust our technical difficulties haven't interfered with business operations. Nothing that couldn't be managed, sir. Caspian's transformation was immediate and complete. The man who had confessed to murder in the darkness became the dutiful son in his father's presence, shoulders squared, in expression carefully neutral. Magnus' gaze shifted to Evangeline, and she felt like a specimen being examined under a microscope. Miss Sinclair, isn't it? I don't believe we've been properly introduced. The use of her false name sent warning bells through her nervous system. If Magnus knew she was Elena Sinclair, that meant he also knew she wasn't Elena Sinclair, which meant the game was far more complicated than she had realized. Actually, Father, Miss Sinclair was just leaving. Caspian moved slightly, positioning himself between Evangeline and his father. There was a minor security breach during the power outage. Nothing serious, but protocol requires honesty, Caspian. Magnus stepped around his son with fluid grace, closing the distance between himself and Evangeline with predatory intent. And Miss Sinclair has been anything but honest with us, haven't you, my dear? The endearment sounded like a threat wrapped in silk. Evangeline's grip tightened on the files, acutely aware that she was now trapped between two Blackthorne men in a hallway with no easy escape route. I don't know what you mean, she said. Of course you don't. Magnus smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. Tell me, how is your Uncle Theodore? Still playing dead, or has he finally worked up the courage to face me directly? The casual mention of Theodore's name hit like a physical blow. Magnus knew everything, had probably known from the moment she walked into the building, which meant every conversation, every stolen file, every carefully planned move had been anticipated and allowed. I see understanding dawning, Magnus continued conversationally. Yes, my dear, we've been aware of your little investigation from the beginning. Did you really think you could infiltrate Blackthorne Industries without our knowledge? Create an entirely new identity without leaving traces that our people couldn't follow? Evangeline's mind raced through the implications. If they had known who she was from the start, then everything that followed had been orchestrated. The job offer, the archive access, even being trapped in the elevator with Caspian during the blackout. The power failure, she whispered, was entirely natural, I'm afraid. Though I must admit, the timing was quite fortunate. Magnus reached into his jacket and withdrew a small device that looked remarkably similar to her digital recorder. You see, while you were busy recording my son's tortured conscience, we were recording everything as well. The device in his hand was sleek and professional, the kind of equipment that suggested surveillance capabilities far beyond anything Theodore had provided her. Evangeline realized with growing horror that she had walked into a trap that had been years in the making. The confession was planned, she said. Caspian's confession was entirely genuine, I assure you, though perhaps not quite as damaging as you imagine. Magnus pocketed the device and clasped his hands behind his back. You see, my dear, what my son failed to mention during his dramatic revelation is that he was never in a position to stop anything. He was brought into that meeting as a witness, not a participant. A young man being educated about the sometimes unpleasant realities of corporate leadership. That's not. Caspian started to object, but his father cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. What is true, Magnus continued, is that certain decisions were made to protect this company from federal prosecution. What is also true is that your parents chose to ignore very generous offers to relocate and start fresh somewhere far from New York. What happened to them was regrettable but necessary. The clinical way he discussed her parents' murder made Evangeline's vision blur with rage. You killed them. I protected my family and my company from people who would have destroyed both out of misguided principles. Magnus stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his expensive cologne. Just as I'm prepared to protect them from their daughter's misguided quest for revenge. You can't touch me. Evangeline held up her own recorder, though her hand was shaking badly enough to make the gesture less threatening than she intended. I have evidence. I have witnesses. The moment something happens to me, Theodore will release everything we've collected. Theodore. Magnus chuckled, the sound devoid of any warmth. Poor, deluded Theodore. Tell me, my dear, when was the last time you actually spoke with your uncle? And I don't mean encrypted messages or coded communications. When was the last time you heard his voice? The question sent ice through her veins. She had assumed Theodore's absence from direct contact was a security measure, a way to protect both of them until the mission was complete. But looking into Magnus' pale eyes, she began to understand the truth. Theodore has been dead for 3 years, Magnus said gently. Unfortunate hiking accident in the Adirondacks. Terrible shame, really. He was so close to achieving his goals. The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Theodore, the uncle who had saved her from the foster system, who had taught her everything she needed to know about corporate warfare, who had spent years planning this moment with her, was gone. Had been gone for years while she continued following plans he would never see completed. You're lying. I'm afraid not. Though I must say, whoever has been communicating with you in his name has done an excellent job maintaining the illusion. Magnus reached out and touched her cheek with paternal gentleness that made her skin crawl. Did you really think we would allow Theodore Rosemont to operate freely for 6 years? The man was brilliant, I'll give him that, but he was also predictable. Evangeline felt the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed, everything she had planned, every sacrifice she had made was built on a foundation of lies. Theodore was dead. Her mission was compromised, and she was standing alone in a hallway with the 2 men who had destroyed everything she had ever loved. Now then, Magnus said, his voice still carrying that terrifying gentleness. Let's discuss what happens next. Magnus' words hung in the air like poison, seeping into every corner of Evangeline's consciousness. Theodore was dead, had been dead for 3 years. Everything she thought she knew about her mission, about her support system, about the man who had saved her from a life of foster care mediocrity, was a lie. I can see you're processing this information. Magnus continued with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. It's understandable. Theodore was quite skilled at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. The communications, Evangeline whispered. The plans, the resources, all provided by us, my dear. Did you think Elena Sinclair's credentials created themselves? That the bribes to plant your records came from Theodore's modest teacher's pension? Magnus gestured toward the elevator bank with casual dismissal. We've been guiding your little investigation from the beginning, ensuring you found exactly what we wanted you to find. The revelation hit like a series of physical blows. Every document she had discovered, every piece of evidence she thought she had uncovered, every step of her carefully orchestrated infiltration had been choreographed by the very people she was trying to destroy. She was a puppet dancing to strings held by her parents' murderers. Why? The word came out broken, barely a whisper. Because sometimes the best way to control a narrative is to let the other side think they're writing it. Magnus' smile was razor-thin. You've spent 10 years believing your parents were innocent victims of corporate greed. The truth is considerably more complicated. They were investigating environmental violations. You said so yourself. They were investigating environmental violations that they themselves had helped orchestrate. Magnus pulled a tablet from his briefcase and swiped through several documents with practiced efficiency. James and Victoria Rosemont weren't the ethical crusaders you remember, my dear. They were partners in one of the most sophisticated environmental fraud schemes the EPA had ever encountered. The tablet screen filled with what appeared to be official documents, emails, financial records. Evangeline's parents' names appeared throughout, linked to shell companies and offshore accounts that suggested a level of corruption she had never imagined possible. That's impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The documents looked authentic, official, damning. Your parents discovered they were being investigated by federal authorities. Rather than face prosecution, they decided to turn state's evidence against their co-conspirators, including Blackthorn Industries. Magnus lowered the tablet, his pale eyes fixed on her face. They weren't heroes, Evangeline. They were criminals trying to save themselves by destroying everyone else. The floor seemed to shift beneath her feet. Everything she had believed about her parents, about their integrity, about the injustice of their deaths, was crumbling like sand castles in a hurricane. But even as the foundations of her world collapsed, something deeper inside her rebelled against accepting Magnus' version of events. "You're lying," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Am I?" Magnus gestured toward Caspian, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. "Tell her, son. Tell her what we found in her parents' private files after the accident." Caspian's face was pale, his gray eyes filled with something that looked like genuine anguish. "Evangeline, please understand that what he's showing you isn't the complete picture. There are things about that investigation, about your parents' involvement, that—" The soft chime of the elevator interrupted his words. The doors slid open to reveal a figure that made Evangeline's heart stop beating entirely. Theodore Rosemont stepped into the hallway, older and grayer than she remembered, but unmistakably alive. His dark eyes swept the scene before fixing on Magnus with undisguised hatred. "Hello, Magnus," he said quietly. "Still telling lies, I see." The silence that followed was deafening. Magnus' carefully controlled composure slipped for the first time since Evangeline had met him, his pale eyes widening with what looked like genuine shock. "Impossible," he breathed. "You're dead. I saw the body myself." "You saw a body." Theodore stepped further into the hallway, moving with the careful precision of someone who had spent years planning this moment. Dental records can be surprisingly easy to falsify when you have the right connections and enough motivation. Evangeline felt tears streaming down her cheeks without realizing she had started crying. "Uncle Theodore, is it really you?" "Hello, sweetheart." His voice gentled as he looked at her, and she saw the same warmth that had carried her through the worst years of her adolescence. "I'm sorry I couldn't contact you directly. Magnus had too many people watching, too many ways to trace communications back to me. But the messages, the planning, were all mine, sent through intermediaries and encryption protocols that even Magnus' best people couldn't crack." Theodore's attention shifted back to the older Blackthorn, his expression hardening. "Though I must admit, I'm impressed by how thoroughly you corrupted my communications with false information." Magnus had recovered his composure, but Evangeline could see the calculating intelligence working behind his eyes. "You always were too clever for your own good, Theodore. How long have you been hiding in plain sight?" "Long enough to gather everything I need to destroy you and everyone who helped you murder my brother." Theodore reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. "Financial records, wiretap conversations, witness testimonies, forensic evidence from James and Victoria's car that proves their brakes were sabotaged. Evidence that will never see the inside of a courtroom," Magnus replied smoothly. "You're a dead man, Theodore. Legally speaking, you don't exist. Any testimony you might offer would be inadmissible. Perhaps, but I'm not the only witness." Theodore's eyes shifted to Caspian, who had gone very still. "Tell them, Caspian. Tell them about the recording you made that night. The one you've been hiding for 10 years. Caspian's face went white. "Theodore, I don't know what you're talking about. The pocket recorder you carried to every business meeting. The one you thought was turned off when your father ordered James and Victoria's execution." Theodore's smile was sharp enough to cut steel. "The one that captured every word of Magnus' confession, including his detailed instructions to the mechanics who sabotaged their car." The revelation hung in the air like a lit fuse. Evangeline looked between the three men, understanding finally dawning. Caspian hadn't just been a witness to her parents' murder. He had been recording it. For 10 years, he had possessed evidence that could have brought justice, and he had done nothing with it. "You knew," she whispered. "All this time, you had proof, and you did nothing." "I was protecting him," Caspian said quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. He was 22 years old and terrified of his own father. "I couldn't let him throw his life away for people who were already gone." "But you kept the recording," Theodore said, "hidden it away somewhere safe, just in case. Because deep down, you knew that someday you might need it to save yourself." Magnus' composure finally cracked completely. "Enough." His voice carried a note of desperation that Evangeline had never heard before. "This conversation is over. Security will escort all of you from the building immediately." "Actually," Theodore said, checking his watch with theatrical precision, "security is otherwise occupied at the moment." It's amazing how many federal agents you can fit in the lobby of a building this size. As if summoned by his words, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairwell. Multiple sets, moving with military precision toward their floor. Magnus' pale eyes darted toward the emergency exits, calculating distances and possibilities for escape. "It's over, Magnus," Theodore said gently. "Finally, after 10 years, it's over." The stairwell doors burst open with military precision, disgorging a team of federal agents in tactical gear. Their leader, a woman with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to taking down corporate empires, stepped forward with her badge held high. "FBI, Magnus Blackthorne, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and violations of the RICO Act." Magnus stood frozen for a moment, his pale eyes darting between the advancing agents and the emergency exits that were already being sealed off by additional personnel. For the first time in his life, the man who had controlled every variable was completely powerless. "This is harassment," he said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "I demand to speak with my attorney." "You'll have that opportunity." The lead agent gestured to her team, who moved forward with practiced efficiency. "Theodore Rosemont, thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. The Department of Justice appreciates your patience during the extended undercover operation." Evangeline's head snapped toward her uncle. "Undercover operation? I've been working with the Federal Task Force for 3 years, sweetheart. Ever since they approached me about faking my death to gather evidence against Magnus." Theodore's expression softened as he looked at her. "I couldn't risk contacting you directly until we were certain we had enough evidence to guarantee convictions. But the messages, the planning, were designed to get you close enough to Caspian to establish an emotional connection that would make him willing to finally turn over the recording." Theodore glanced at the younger Blackthorne, who stood motionless as his father was read his rights. "We needed him to choose justice over family loyalty, and we needed that choice to feel like his own." The pieces of the elaborate deception finally clicked into place. The entire infiltration had been orchestrated not to destroy Blackthorne Industries, but to save the one member of the family who might be worth saving. Everything from her job interview to the power outage to the intimate confessions in the elevator had been calculated to create the emotional bonds necessary to break Caspian free from his father's influence. "You manipulated both of us," she said, but there was no anger in her voice. Only wonder at the complexity of what Theodore had accomplished. "I gave you both the opportunity to choose who you wanted to be." Theodore watched as Magnus was led away in handcuffs, his silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled. "What you did with that opportunity was entirely up to you." Caspian finally moved, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a small digital device that looked antiquated compared to modern recording equipment. "Agent Morrison, I believe this belongs to you." The FBI agent accepted the recorder with something approaching reverence. "Mr. Blackthorne, this device contains the primary evidence in a federal murder case. Are you prepared to testify that this recording was made with your knowledge and that the voices on it accurately represent conversations that took place in your presence?" "Yes." The word came out quietly, but with absolute certainty. "I should have turned it over years ago. I should have been brave enough to do the right thing when it mattered." "You're doing it now," Evangeline said softly. "That has to count for something." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the man who had confessed his deepest failures in the darkness of a powerless elevator. Beneath the corporate armor and family legacy, Caspian Blackthorne was just someone who had spent 10 years trying to live with an impossible choice. "Miss Rosemont," Agent Morrison addressed her directly, "your uncle has briefed us on your role in this investigation. The Department of Justice would like to extend our gratitude for your service, though I understand much of your participation was under false pretenses." "It was," Theodore confirmed. She believed she was working independently. "I couldn't risk compromising the federal investigation by bringing her into the operation officially." "I understand." Evangeline watched the last of the FBI agents disappear into the elevator with their prisoner. "Uncle Theodore, what happens now?" "Now we rebuild." He smiled, and she saw the man who had rescued her from foster care and taught her that family was worth fighting for. "Your parents' company can be restored. Their names can be cleared, and you can finally have the life they would have wanted you to live." "What about Blackthorne Industries?" "That," Theodore said, glancing meaningfully at Caspian, will depend on its new leadership. The implications hung in the air between them. With Magnus facing federal prosecution, control of the company would fall to Caspian. He could rebuild it into something honorable, or he could let it die with his father's legacy. "I know what I want to do," Caspian said quietly, "but I can't do it alone." "You won't be alone." Evangeline stepped closer to him, close enough to catch the scent of his cologne and remember the way he had touched her face in the darkness. "If you're willing to do the work, to make the changes that need to be made, to honor the people who were hurt by your family's actions." "I am." He reached out tentatively, and when she didn't pull away, he cupped her face the same way he had in the elevator. "But first, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have said hours ago." "What?" "I think I'm falling in love with you." The confession hung between them like a bridge across 10 years of grief and guilt. Around them, the corporate machinery of Blackthorn Industries hummed with its usual efficiency, but Evangeline could only hear the sound of her own heartbeat. "That's inconvenient," she said finally. "Very. We have about 1,000 reasons why it could never work. At least 1,000. And you're still technically my boss. Not for much longer." His thumb traced along her jawline, the touch gentle and reverent. "I'm planning to restructure the company. New leadership, new policies, new name. Sterling Rosemont Industries has a nice ring to it, don't you think?" The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that it stole her breath entirely. "Caspian, marry me." The proposal came out of nowhere, spoken with the same quiet certainty he had used to confess his father's crimes. Evangeline stared at him, acutely aware that Theodore was watching their exchange with undisguised amusement. "We've known each other for exactly 1 day," she pointed out. "The best day of my life. I threatened to destroy your family. You succeeded, and it was exactly what we deserved." "This is insane." "Completely." He smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face. "Say yes anyway." Evangeline looked around the hallway where her parents' killer had just been arrested, where the company that had destroyed her family would be rebuilt in their honor, where the uncle she thought was dead stood grinning like he had orchestrated the entire romantic scene along with everything else. "Ask me again in the elevator," she said finally. Caspian's smile widened. "The elevator? Where it all started. Where you first asked if I'd ever been kissed. And where I'm going to kiss you for the first time," he said, taking her hand and leading her toward the elevator bank. "And second," she added, "and third, and every day after that for the rest of our lives." The elevator doors opened as if summoned by their combined will. As they stepped inside together, Evangeline caught a glimpse of Theodore wiping tears from his eyes. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," he called after them. "Both of you." The doors closed, sealing them into the small space where confessions had been made and truths revealed, and two damaged hearts had found their way to each other through a decade of darkness. "Evangeline Rosemont," Caspian said formally, dropping to one knee in the elevator car. "Will you marry me and help me spend the rest of my life making up for the worst thing my family ever did?" "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes." When he kissed her, it was with 10 years of regret and a lifetime of promise, soft and desperate and perfect. Outside the elevator, New York City hummed with its usual chaos, but inside their small metal sanctuary, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances began planning a future built on justice, forgiveness, and the radical idea that sometimes the best things grow from the worst beginnings. The elevator carried them up toward the sky, toward tomorrow, toward whatever came next for the woman who had been both Elena Sinclair and Evangeline Rosemont, and the man who would spend his life proving that redemption was possible for even the most broken hearts. 2 years later, morning sunlight filtered through the windows of the 47th floor office, illuminating the golden nameplate on the door that now read Sterling Rosemont Industries. Evangeline adjusted the wedding ring on her finger, a smile touching her lips as she watched Manhattan wake up once again. The same skyline that had once represented pain and loss now symbolized hope and new beginnings. "Mrs. Blackthorn," Caspian's voice reached her, filled with affection and a hint of amusement. "It's still strange hearing my own surname sound so perfect." She turned to find him in the doorway, holding 2 coffee cups and wearing the smile that had stolen her heart in that elevator 2 years ago. The impeccable corporate suit had been replaced with something more casual, reflecting the changes they had implemented in the company. Sterling Rosemont Industries operated with a completely different philosophy than the old Blackthorn Industries. "How did the hearing go?" she asked, accepting the coffee and settling beside him on the couch that had replaced Magnus' imposing desk. Magnus was sentenced to 25 years without possibility of parole. The satisfaction in Caspian's voice was evident, but tempered with relief more than vengeance. "Agent Morrison said your testimony was crucial in sealing the case." Evangeline nodded, feeling a weight finally lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served. Her parents could rest in peace. "Theodore called earlier," she said. "He wants to know if we're still planning to name him CEO of the Environmental Sustainability Division. Considering he practically redesigned our environmental policies from scratch, I think it would be criminal not to promote him." Caspian laughed, wrapping his arm around her. "Besides, he threatened to tell embarrassing stories about you at the board meeting if I don't give him the position." "He wouldn't dare." "He absolutely would." They laughed together, a sound that echoed through the office where so many dark secrets had once been kept. Now, the walls were decorated with photos of their employees, environmental certifications, and a framed picture of James and Victoria Rosemont from the day they founded their company. "I have a surprise for you," Evangeline said, standing and walking to the desk. She picked up a thick envelope and handed it to Caspian with a mysterious smile. He opened it carefully, his eyes widening as he read. "Evangeline, this is the deed to the house where I grew up. I managed to buy it back from the current owners." Her voice trembled slightly. "I thought maybe we could raise them there. Our children. Give them the stable childhood we both lost." Caspian pulled her into his arms, spinning her in the air before kissing her with all the passion and tenderness that had grown between them. "I love you, Mrs. Blackthorn, more than I thought it was possible to love someone. I love you too." She rested her forehead against his, feeling completely home for the first time in years. Who would have thought that getting trapped in an elevator would change everything? Fate has a peculiar sense of humor. Outside, the city continued its frantic pace. But there on the 47th floor, two souls who had found their way to each other through darkness and pain were writing a new chapter. A chapter of love, redemption, and proof that sometimes the most unlikely endings are also the most perfect. Sterling Rosemont Industries would thrive. Their children would grow up knowing the truth about their grandparents and the value of justice. And every time they entered an elevator together, they would remember the day two lost souls found each other in the space between floors and discovered that true love is worth any wait.